When it comes to history, maritime pursuits have always played a major role in expanding the reach of humankind. From early migrations, like those of the Austronesian people, to the trade networks built by the Phoenicians, the sea has always connected distant civilizations and shaped human progress. Over time, coastal settlements turned into key economic centers. Their locations made them valuable and worth defending. This need for protection gave rise to the world's first naval powers. From that point onward, people began designing ships not just for travel or trade, but specifically for battle. These became the first true warships, vessels created for defense, attack, and control of the seas. Among these designs, the galley stands out as one of the most consistent and long-lasting. A galley was mainly powered by rows of oars instead of sails. Simple but effective, it survived for thousands of years, from around 1500 BC up until the 17th century AD, constantly evolving with new materials and weapon systems. It's important to understand that a war galley wasn't one single type of ship, but a basic design that influenced many later warships. Over centuries, this design became the foundation for different styles of naval vessels. Later came the frigate, a fast and maneuverable warship built for speed. In the 17th century, frigates were smaller than the main ships of the line and carried lighter weapons, making them ideal for scouting and quick strikes. Even smaller were the corvettes, often adapted from sloops. These ships were mainly used for coastal defense, raids, and smaller naval battles during what became known as the Age of Sails, roughly between 1571 and 1862. In this video, we'll take a look at some of the most remarkable historical warships, from oar-powered galleys to fully rigged sailing vessels. These ships tell the story of human innovation across 2,500 years of maritime history, from the 7th century BC to the 17th century AD. If you enjoy learning about ancient technology, naval warfare, and the evolution of ships through history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to stay tuned for more fascinating stories from the past. Bireme and trireme, origins from circa 7th century BC, Herodotus, often called the father of history, once mentioned a type of ancient Greek ship known as the pentaconter, a long, narrow vessel equipped with a single row of oars on each side, possibly around 25 in total. At first glance, it might have looked simple, but it represented a major leap forward in naval technology. These ships were light, fast, and incredibly versatile, perfect for a time when the line between trade and warfare was thin. The pentaconter served multiple purposes. It could explore distant coastlines, carry goods across the Aegean, and, when needed, chase down enemy raiders. It was one of the first tools that allowed Greek city-states and colonies to extend their influence across the Mediterranean, maintaining communication, control, and trade over long distances. But soon, the demands of naval warfare began to grow. As rival powers clashed over trade routes and dominance at sea, the Greeks sought to design something faster, stronger, and deadlier. That evolution gave rise to the bireme, a ship that would change the way ancient navies fought. The bireme, whose name comes from the Latin word remus, meaning oar, was a far more sophisticated machine. It stretched around 80 feet in length and featured 2 full decks of oars on each side, doubling its power and speed. It carried a single large mast fitted with a broad rectangular sail for long-distance travel, but its true weapon was the embalon, or battering ram. Mounted at the prow, this massive, bronze-tipped beak was designed to smash through the wooden hulls of enemy ships, a devastating tactic in close naval battles. Some historians believe the Greeks took inspiration for the bireme from the fast, efficient war galleys of the Phoenicians, the master sailors of the ancient world. Whatever its origin, the bireme quickly proved its worth, dominating the seas for generations. Yet, as with all military innovations, the competition never stopped. And within just a few centuries, an even more formidable design appeared: the trireme. The trireme, as its name suggests, carried 3 decks of oars, each manned by skilled rowers working in perfect unison. It was larger, sturdier, and much more advanced than its predecessors, featuring double masts, one large and one small, that allowed for greater control in varying winds. At full strength, a trireme could have a crew of nearly 200 men, with about 170 rowers powering the ship's relentless rhythm through the waves. These weren't just ships. They were floating military machines. Every man aboard had a role to play. The Athenian navy, in particular, was famous for its efficiency and discipline. Each trireme had a dedicated captain called the triarchos, who oversaw the sailors, rowers, and marines with precision. Under his command, these crews became some of the most well-trained and feared forces in the ancient Mediterranean. By the 4th century BC, the trireme's dominance was absolute. Yet naval engineers and rulers still sought bigger and more powerful designs. The trireme eventually evolved into the quadrireme and quinquereme, adding more rows of oars and men, and in some cases, reaching truly colossal scales. One of the most astonishing examples came from Egypt, under the rule of Ptolemy IV Philopator. His legendary ship, the Tessaraconteres, was said to have 40 tiers of oars and 7 massive rams. According to the ancient writer Athenaeus, it was manned by a staggering 7,250 men, including 400 sailors for the sails, 4,000 rowers, and nearly 3,000 armed marines. To put that into perspective, that's more crew than the world's largest modern aircraft carriers. Meanwhile, in the Western Mediterranean, 2 giants, Rome and Carthage, built enormous fleets of quadriremes and quinqueremes. They didn't just rely on ramming anymore. Their warships began to carry artillery, including catapults and ballistae capable of launching deadly projectiles across the sea. But Rome added something truly unique: a tactical invention that turned naval warfare into something closer to land combat. It was called the corvus, Latin for crow. This ingenious device was a kind of rotating boarding bridge attached to a tall wooden pillar, about 12 feet high. At the end of the bridge was a sharp iron spike, the beak of the crow. During battle, Roman sailors would drop the corvus onto an enemy ship's deck, where the spike would bite into the wood and lock the 2 ships together. Then, Roman soldiers, masters of close-quarter combat, would rush across the bridge and storm the enemy vessel hand to hand. With this clever tool, Rome turned sea battles into miniature land battles, playing to their greatest strength: disciplined infantry warfare. Through these centuries, the evolution of ancient warships, from the humble pentaconter to the mighty quinquereme, tells the story of how human ingenuity kept pushing the limits of what was possible on water. Each design reflected not just a change in engineering, but a shift in how civilizations thought about war, power, and the endless battle to rule the seas. Liburnian, origins from circa 2nd century BC. After the Roman Republic finally gained the upper hand against the powerful Carthaginian Empire, the Mediterranean became, for the first time, a Roman lake. Their naval dominance was unmatched. With no major rivals left, the Republic's war fleets settled into a new era of control and confidence. By this point, Roman shipbuilding had reached a peak of refinement. The standard war galley of the time was a fully decked vessel, a sturdy, dependable design featuring partially submerged rams for smashing enemy hulls, mechanical artillery like catapults and ballistae, and even small turrets that allowed archers to fire from elevated positions. These ships were not just tools of war. They were symbols of Rome's dominance at sea. But Roman ingenuity was never content to rest. Even when their supremacy seemed secure, they continued to innovate, often out of sheer necessity. One famous example comes from 56 BC, during Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. In a desperate naval encounter against the Veneti, a seafaring tribe from the western coast of Gaul, the Romans faced a serious challenge. The Veneti ships were massive, heavy, and built to withstand rough Atlantic seas. Their sails and rigging made them difficult to approach, let alone destroy. Commanding the Roman fleet was Decimus Brutus, a man known for his resourcefulness. Realizing that traditional ramming tactics wouldn't work, Brutus came up with a bold and unorthodox plan. His sailors threw grappling hooks attached to long poles over the enemy ships, pulling tight to cut the rigging and collapse the Veneti sails. Once the great vessels were stripped of their wind power, they became helpless, floating targets for Roman marines. It was a brilliant display of quick thinking and tactical creativity that turned the tide of battle. However, as the decades passed and Rome's supremacy over the Mediterranean solidified, the need for large-scale naval warfare began to fade. There were no Carthaginians left to fight, only scattered threats, smaller skirmishes, and a new, fast-moving enemy: pirates. By the 1st century BC, piracy had become a real menace. Light, maneuverable raiders in small ships terrorized the coasts of Illyria and the islands of the Adriatic, striking fast and disappearing before heavier Roman galleys could respond. The old, lumbering quadriremes were too slow for this kind of enemy. Rome needed something new, something fast, agile, and efficient. The answer came in the form of a smaller, sleeker vessel inspired by those very pirate ships: the Liburnian, or Liburnidus. This new design took its name from the Liburni, a seafaring tribe of the Adriatic who were known for their swift, shallow, drafted ships. The Romans borrowed their design, and then perfected it. At first, the Liburnian was a single-banked galley, relying on one row of oars per side. Later versions added a second bank for extra speed and power. Unlike the massive war galleys of earlier centuries, these ships were light, nimble, and built for quick strikes. They could chase down pirates, scout ahead of larger fleets, or serve as escorts for merchant convoys, true multi-role vessels for an empire that now ruled the seas. Over time, the Liburnian became a versatile workhorse of the Roman navy. Some variants were strengthened with heavier hulls and bronze rams for direct combat, while others remained lighter and faster for reconnaissance or patrol duties. Their adaptability made them indispensable across the empire's vast maritime frontiers. By the dawn of the Roman Empire, the term Liburnian had become almost a catch-all word for Roman warships, and even for some merchant vessels. These ships represented the shift from grand naval wars to the everyday control and protection of trade routes, the quiet, steady work of maintaining empire. The Liburnian's most famous moment came in 31-22 BC, during one of the most decisive battles in naval history, the Battle of Actium. On one side stood Mark Antony and Cleopatra, commanding massive, heavily armed ships. On the other, Marcus Agrippa, Rome's greatest admiral, led the fleet of Octavian, the man who would soon become Emperor Augustus. Agrippa's fleet was made up largely of Liburnian galleys, smaller, faster, and far more maneuverable than Antony's massive warships. When the two forces met, speed won over size. Agrippa's Liburnians darted between the enemy lines, surrounding and isolating Antony's slower vessels. The battle ended in a crushing victory for Rome, and the Liburnian design proved its worth as one of the most effective warships ever built. From pirate chasers to instruments of empire, the Liburnian symbolized a new chapter in naval warfare, one that valued speed, adaptability, and precision over brute strength. It was the ship that carried Rome from the age of conquest into the age of control. Dromon, origins circa 4th–5th century AD, by the 5th century AD, a new kind of warship ruled the Mediterranean seas, the dromon, whose name meant runner or racer. The title said it all. This was a vessel built for speed, precision, and endurance. A warship that could strike fast and vanish just as quickly. Unlike the heavier Roman galleys that came before it, the dromon was a streamlined galley-type craft designed for agility. Earlier Greek and Roman ships often relied on bulky outriggers to balance their oars, but the dromon abandoned that feature entirely. Instead, it had a sleeker hull, allowing it to glide more efficiently through the waves, a critical advantage in the unpredictable Mediterranean waters. Many historians believe the dromon evolved directly from the Liburnian, the fast, maneuverable Roman galley that had once crushed the fleets of pirates and rebels. Over the centuries, this design was refined, reinforced, and modernized to meet new challenges. By the early medieval period, the dromon had become the backbone of the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, navy, which dominated the seas for nearly 700 years. From roughly the 5th to the 12th century AD, the dromon was everywhere. From the harbors of Constantinople to the coasts of Sicily and Syria. It was the workhorse of an empire that depended on maritime control. And it wasn't just the Byzantines who recognized its value. Their greatest rivals, the Arab navies, soon developed similar designs around the 7th century AD, leading to fierce naval encounters that would shape the medieval Mediterranean world. In terms of engineering, the dromon was a clear leap forward. It often featured a full upper deck, known as the catastroma, which could carry archers, marines, and even artillery. But one thing the dromon didn't have was the traditional battering ram found on older Greek or Roman ships. Instead, its designers replaced it with an above-water spur, a sharp projection built at the bow. This spur wasn't meant to smash into enemy hulls, but to break their oars, crippling their movement and leaving them defenseless. This new approach marked a change in naval strategy. Battles were no longer just about ramming and boarding. They were about speed, coordination, and tactical strikes. The dromon could maneuver swiftly, hit where it hurt most, and retreat before the enemy could respond. Another key feature of the dromon was its sailing system. While oars remained vital for close combat and maneuvering, the dromon also adopted lateen sails, triangular sails that could catch the wind from multiple directions, giving the ship remarkable versatility. These sails are believed to have been introduced by Arab shipbuilders, who themselves likely borrowed the concept from Indian maritime traditions. It was a global exchange of ideas, stitched together by centuries of seafaring innovation. Whether it carried one bank or two banks of oars, the dromon's combination of human power and advanced sail design made it one of the most efficient warships of its age. Fast, elegant, and deadly when commanded by skilled sailors. It symbolized the rebirth of naval power after the fall of Rome. A design that kept the Byzantine Empire's naval supremacy alive for hundreds of years. The dromon wasn't just a ship, it was a statement. Proof that even as empires rose and fell, the quest for control over the seas never truly stopped. Never truly stopped. Fireship, used in different eras. From circa 5th century BC, 19th century AD. A fireship is not one single design so much as a tactic. A vessel turned into a weapon by setting it ablaze, or arming it with incendiary devices and directing it toward an enemy. Because of that, fireships appear across many eras and theaters of war, from ancient Greece to the age of sail. One of the earliest recorded uses comes from the Sicilian expedition, circa 413 BC, when the Syracusans set a ship on fire and steered it toward the Athenian fleet. The Athenians managed to put the flames out and escape disaster that time, but the episode shows how dramatic and destructive the idea could be. Centuries later, a similar tactic appears again in China, at the Battle of Red Cliffs, circa 208 AD, where General Huang Gai launched burning vessels loaded with kindling, reeds, and oil against Cao Cao's fleet, a decisive and devastating use of flame at sea. The most famous and fearsome form of incendiary naval weapon was Greek fire, developed and deployed by the Eastern Romans, Byzantines, around the 7th century AD. Instead of a simple burning hulk, Byzantines equipped their fast dromons with siphons and pumps that could spray a sticky, burning liquid. This liquid fire clung to wood and continued to burn even on water, a terror on the waves. Contemporary writers record how ordinary water did little against it. Only sand, strong vinegar, or other extreme measures could smother those flames. Greek fire was a closely guarded military secret. The exact recipe was kept under lock and key and has been lost to history. Modern scholars speculate it may have contained things like petroleum or naphtha, pitch, sulfur, resin, quicklime, and bitumen, perhaps mixed with a now-forgotten additive. Whatever the formula, its effect was psychological as well as physical. It could rout fleets and protect cities, and Byzantium used it to repel sieges and win key naval battles. Fireship concepts were not unique to Byzantium. There are accounts of Song dynasty Chinese using flamethrower-equipped vessels, and by the Age of Sail, 16th–19th centuries, European navies adapted the idea into explosive fireships. These later versions were packed with tar, fat, and gunpowder, set alight, and steered toward anchored or moored enemy ships. A small crew would steer the vessel close, then cut away and escape before impact. Because these attacks worked best against stationary targets, they were often reserved for harbor assaults and night raids rather than open-sea battles. Across time, the fireship shows a simple truth about naval warfare. When direct force failed, commanders turned to clever, and sometimes brutal, ideas to break their enemy's line, morale, or defenses. Viking longship. Circa 10th century AD, the Viking longship became one of the most recognizable symbols of the Viking Age. These ships were central to their raids, trade, and exploration. But in reality, Viking vessels came in several different forms, not just one. Before the 10th century, the Vikings used similar ships for both war and trade. The same vessel that carried goods across the North Sea could also be used for raiding. Early attacks, like the famous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD, were most likely carried out using such mixed-purpose ships rather than the highly specialized ones often shown in films. By the late 9th and 10th centuries, as Viking military forces became more organized, they started to build ships designed specifically for speed and battle. These included the Snekja, thin one, the Skeed, that cuts through water, and the Drekar, or Drakar, the dragon ship, named after the carved dragon heads on their prows. Longships were long, narrow, and fast. Their shallow draft allowed them to travel in both deep seas and shallow rivers, making quick raids possible almost anywhere. For trading, the Vikings also built broader ships called koopskip, which could carry heavier cargo and relied more on sails than oars. Usually, one man was enough for each oar while sailing peacefully. But in battle he was joined by two others, one to help row faster and another to shield him from enemy arrows. This teamwork made the longship both quick and durable in combat. As the Viking world grew wealthier, their ships grew larger too. One famous example was King Olaf Tryggvason's Long Serpent, built around the year 1000 AD. Norse sagas claim it carried hundreds of warriors at the Battle of Svolder, possibly more than 300 in total, a remarkable size for its time. The Viking longship combined practicality, power, and elegance. It could sail across open oceans and glide up narrow rivers with equal ease. More than just a weapon or a means of travel, it was a symbol of freedom, exploration, and the unmatched seamanship that defined the Viking Age. Carrack, origins in 14th century AD, The carrack is considered one of the most important milestones in the history of ship design. It marked the transition from the oar-powered galleys of the past to the fully sail-driven ships that would dominate the world's oceans for centuries. Unlike earlier vessels that still relied on oars for maneuvering, the carrack depended entirely on the power of the wind. Its strong masts carried large sails, giving it both endurance and range, two qualities that opened new horizons for exploration and trade. A typical carrack was square-rigged on its foremast and mainmast, while its smaller mizzenmast carried a lateen sail, the triangular type that offered more control. This combination made it adaptable for long voyages through changing winds and weather. Built with carvel planked hulls, where the planks were laid edge to edge, the carrack had a smoother and stronger body than earlier ships. Many were enormous for their time, with some versions reaching up to 1,000 tons in capacity. By the early 16th century, the carrack, known as the Nao in the Mediterranean, had become the standard vessel for both Atlantic trade and global exploration. It was large enough to carry heavy cargo and provisions, yet sturdy enough to be armed for defense. Its tall forecastle and aft castle made it a formidable presence in battle, while the broad decks gave space for crew, cannons, and goods. This balance between strength, cargo space, and seaworthiness made the carrack ideal as both a merchant ship and a warship. In many ways, the carrack became the foundation for the great sailing ships of the Age of Discovery. It was aboard carracks that explorers like Columbus and da Gama crossed into the unknown, carrying with them the ambitions and rivalries that would reshape the world's map. Caravel, origins in the 15th century AD. As European exploration expanded, shipbuilders began searching for a design that was lighter and more agile than the large, heavy carracks. The answer came from Portugal in the form of the caravel, a smaller but highly maneuverable sailing ship that would soon play a key role in the Age of Discovery. The caravel usually carried 3 masts and featured what we might call modular sails. Its sails could be adjusted depending on the voyage and wind conditions, an innovation that made it far more versatile than its predecessors. Some caravels used lateen sails, known as caravella latina, triangular in shape, ideal for sailing close to the wind. Others used square sails, caravella redonda, for better speed on open seas. This combination of speed, control, and adaptability made the caravel the perfect vessel for long-distance exploration. It was fast enough to scout new routes, small enough to navigate coastlines, and sturdy enough to handle the rough Atlantic waters. The caravel became the flagship of Portuguese exploration, carrying explorers such as Bartolomeu Dias and Vasco da Gama along the coasts of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. Later, the Spanish adopted the same design, most famously in Columbus's voyage to the Americas, where the Niña and the Pinta were both caravels. By the late 15th century, the design continued to evolve. Larger versions were built, sometimes with 4 masts and a mix of both square and lateen rigs. These later caravels could even serve as light warships, equipped with small cannons and modest castles at the bow and stern. Though the caravel would eventually be replaced by larger ocean-going vessels, its legacy was unmatched. It was the ship that carried Europe into a new age of discovery, a perfect balance of speed, endurance, and innovation. Galleass, origins in late 15th century AD. The galleass emerged as a transitional design, a deliberate attempt to combine the best features of 2 very different kinds of ships: the oar-powered galley and the fully sail-driven warship. It was, in many ways, a product of experimentation during a period when naval warfare was rapidly changing. A typical galleass carried about 32 oars and 3 masts. The oars gave it the maneuverability needed for close combat or calm seas, while the sails allowed it to travel longer distances without exhausting the crew. Inside its broad hull, There was enough space to mount heavy artillery, something earlier galleys could not manage. This made the galleass both agile and powerfully armed, a true hybrid of speed and strength. The design was quickly adopted by several maritime powers. The Venetians became its greatest masters, using galleasses to great effect in the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, one of the largest naval battles in history. Their firepower and stability gave the Christian fleet a decisive advantage over the Ottoman armada. The Ottomans, in turn, developed similar ships of their own, which they called mahons. Yet the galleass also revealed the limits of compromise. Its hull, based on the old galley structure, could not support the large, square sails that ocean voyages demanded. And though it was bigger than a normal galley, that same bulk reduced its agility in battle. It was too heavy to row easily and too awkward to sail efficiently in strong winds. Over time, as shipbuilders perfected larger, fully rigged sailing warships, the galleass faded from use. But for a brief moment in naval history, it represented an important step forward, a bold experiment that bridged the ancient world of oars and the modern age of sails. Chebec. Origins in 16th century AD, the Chebec, also known as the Xebec, was North Africa's answer to the powerful European sailing warships that dominated the Mediterranean. The word itself likely comes from the Arabic term for small ship, and that description fits its design perfectly. Fast, elegant, and built for quick strikes. The Chebec evolved from the older war galleys used by the Barbary pirates, who needed vessels capable of chasing down merchant ships and escaping the slower, heavier European fleets. To counter the firepower of those larger ships, the Chebec was equipped with broadside cannons, mounted along its sides, a feature once reserved for the massive European carracks and galleons. Despite this added weaponry, the Chebec remained smaller, lighter, and far more streamlined than its European rivals. Its long, narrow hull and sharply angled prow cut through the water with remarkable speed. Over time, the design evolved further. The oars were abandoned entirely, and the Chebec became a fully sail-powered warship, driven by 3 large lateen sails. These triangular sails, stretched on long, slanted yards, gave the ship excellent control and balance, even in shifting winds. The masts were set at sharper angles than those of European vessels, allowing the Chebec to turn faster and sail closer to the wind. Every detail of its design, from its slim hull to its tall, sweeping sails, emphasized agility and speed over brute strength. This combination made the Chebec one of the most maneuverable ships of its era. It could dart in for a strike, unleash its cannons, and retreat before a slower opponent could react. Its effectiveness did not go unnoticed. By the 18th century, both France and Spain had adopted the Chebec design for their own navies, recognizing that its speed and versatility made it ideal for coastal warfare, escort missions, and anti-piracy patrols. In many ways, the Chebec represented the peak of Mediterranean naval craftsmanship, a perfect balance of beauty, speed, and deadly precision, bridging the gap between the traditional galley and the modern sailing frigate. Turtle ship, origins in the late 16th century. In 1592, when the Japanese warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi launched his invasion of Korea, his forces entered battle with 2 major advantages: Portuguese-supplied muskets and a fierce naval tactic that focused on boarding enemy ships after heavy cannon fire. The Koreans, however, had a commander who refused to fight on his enemy's terms. Admiral Yi Sun-sin Yi's response to Japan's superior weaponry was both creative and revolutionary. The turtle ship, or Jeobukseon in Korean, designed under his direction and financed through private contributions, these unique vessels completely redefined naval warfare in East Asia. Each turtle ship measured roughly 120 feet long and 30 feet wide, built around a strong wooden frame of red pine and spruce. Its hull was U-shaped for extra stability, and its 3 armored decks protected the crew of over 80 rowers and sailors who powered and operated the ship. 2 large masts carried sails, but it was the ship's defensive design that made it truly extraordinary. The most distinctive feature of the turtle ship was its iron-plated roof, covered with rows of sharp metal spikes, sometimes hidden beneath straw mats, to lure the enemy into boarding attempts. Any Japanese soldiers who tried to jump onto the deck met a deadly surprise. This innovation effectively neutralized one of Japan's strongest naval tactics. But defense was only half the story. Along its sides were 23 cannon ports, each housing one of 5 different types of Korean cannons, capable of striking targets between 300 and 500 meters away. These gave the turtle ship tremendous firepower and allowed it to dominate from a distance. Finally, at the bow stood the ship's most famous feature, a carved dragon head, which was not just symbolic, but functional. Inside, it was a device that released sulfur smoke, both to obscure the ship's movement and to terrify the enemy. Imagine seeing a massive, spiked, smoke-breathing iron vessel emerging from the fog. It's no wonder Japanese sailors called it a sea monster. The turtle ship was centuries ahead of its time, combining armor, artillery, and psychological warfare in one design. Under Admiral Yi's command, these ships helped turn the tide of war, proving that innovation could overcome superior numbers and weaponry. Galleon, origins in 16th century AD. According to historian Angus Constam, the early 16th century marked a major turning point in naval engineering. Shipbuilders across Europe were experimenting with new sailing rigs, stronger hulls, and better artillery systems, leading to the creation of one of the most iconic warships in maritime history, the galleon. The galleon was born from the best qualities of 2 earlier designs. It had the maneuverability of the caravel and the strength and size of the carrack. Unlike its predecessors, it was built from the keel up as a true warship, meant for naval combat rather than trade, though many versions still retained some cargo capacity for long voyages. After the 1570s, it was the Spanish Navy that perfected the galleon design, producing the famous Royal Galleons of the Spanish Armada. These ships were powerful and elegant, some displacing up to 1,000 tons and carrying around 50 cannons, while smaller versions carried about 30 guns. Their hulls were narrower and more hydrodynamic than the bulky carracks that came before them, giving them better speed and stability in heavy seas. Visually, the galleon was instantly recognizable, with a sharp, raised stern, a longer and sleeker length-to-beam ratio, and multiple decks armed with rows of cannons. These improvements made it both graceful and deadly, capable of delivering devastating broadsides while still maneuvering effectively in battle. By the early 17th century, however, the design began to evolve once again. The massive galleons of the Armada years were gradually replaced by smaller, faster versions, which served as escorts and armed cargo ships on the lucrative transatlantic trade routes that connected Spain to its colonies in the Americas. On board, the galleon carried a diverse array of artillery, reflecting the rapid changes in naval firepower at the time. Heavy cannons, and long culebrinas, culverins, formed the main battery, while pedreros, short-range stone-firing, guns, and bombardettas, early wrought-iron cannons, provided supporting fire. Mounted along the upper decks were versos, small swivel guns that could be aimed quickly for close defense. As technology advanced, some of these older weapons, like the pedreros and bombardettas, became outdated, but the versos, with their fast, breech-loading mechanisms, remained effective for both solid shot and grape shot ammunition. The galleon represented the peak of 16th century naval design, a perfect balance of firepower, endurance, and beauty. It was the ship of empire, exploration, and war, carrying both soldiers and treasures across the world's oceans and laying the foundation for the great ships that would follow in the centuries to come. Schooner. Origins in the 17th century. The schooner was a relatively small and fast-sailing vessel that appeared in the 17th century, usually built with 2 or more masts, each carrying fore and aft sails. While modest in size compared to the large warships of the era, the schooner's strength lay in its speed and agility. These ships, along with the even smaller sloops, became the preferred vessels of pirates operating in the Caribbean between 1660 and 1730 AD, the period often called the Golden Age of piracy. Their choice was practical. A schooner could move quickly, maneuver sharply, and slip in and out of shallow coastal waters where heavy naval ships could not follow. Pirates rarely attacked powerful warships. Instead, they targeted merchant vessels, which were slower, lightly defended, and full of valuable cargo. The schooner's smaller size and narrow profile made it less noticeable from a distance, perfect for ambushes and quick escapes. Despite their size, these ships were not defenseless. A typical sloop or schooner carried several light cannons, most often the 4-pounder, also known as the Canon de Fort Gribeauval. Weighing about 637 pounds, this small but reliable gun could fire across distances of more than 2,300 yards, more than enough for a fast hit-and-run encounter. Larger pirate ships, like Black Bart's famous Royal Fortune, were armed with heavier guns, including 8-pounders and 12-pounders, giving them a balance between firepower and speed. In the end, the schooner was not designed to dominate naval battles. It was built to outsmart and outrun. Its combination of light construction, swift handling, and decent armament made it ideal for the unpredictable, fast-paced warfare that defined piracy in the Caribbean. By the mid-17th century, naval warfare had entered a new and more organized era. Despite the many structural and tactical improvements made to the Spanish galleon, the nature of sea battles was changing. Commanders began to favor discipline and formation over individual ship maneuvering. One major innovation defined this shift: the line of battle. Instead of charging at will or fighting in scattered groups, ships now sailed end to end in a single line, each one positioned to fire broadsides without hitting its allies. This formation turned fleets into massive, coordinated firing platforms, capable of unleashing devastating waves of cannon fire in perfect sequence. This new tactic changed everything. Ships were no longer seen as swift raiders or multi-purpose vessels. They became floating artillery batteries, built to deliver maximum firepower from their sides. To meet this new role, shipbuilders began constructing heavier, broader, and more stable vessels, each carrying dozens of cannons arranged along their decks. These new giants of the sea became known as ships of the line, the backbone of European navies for the next 2 centuries. They marked the end of the elegant, slender warships like the galleon, which suddenly seemed outdated in this age of disciplined formations and thunderous broadsides. The rise of the ship of the line signaled the beginning of modern naval warfare, where strategy, firepower, and formation ruled the seas, and where the age of the great sailing empires truly began.